I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Today we present the sixth and final session of Doing the Right Thing, an exploration of ethics with Brit Hume, Robert George, and Chuck Colson. As with the other sessions, this episode was filmed in front of a student audience. Let's get right to session 6, Ethics in Public Life. Here is series host Brit Hume.
Welcome back to Princeton, where we've held over these past weeks a series of classroom discussions about ethics. This is brought to you by the Witherspoon Institute here at Princeton and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview in Lansdowne, Virginia. It's an effort to educate people on doing what is right. We've dealt in this series with the economic meltdown of 2008, how moral law is essential for a foundation of ethics, and the question of whether, even when we know what is right, do we have the will to do it? And then we got into the application of ethical standards to medicine and life, to the marketplace, and finally today, to the public square. How to create a just society. What is a just society? What are the ethical standards by which we can promote human flourishing, not only in our nation, but even around the world? Come join us. Welcome all to our sixth and final session. Our friend Dr. Glenn Sunshine has rejoined the panel. Today's topic: can we have good ethics in public life? We're all familiar with Washington political scandals. I've spent a professional career covering them. There are plenty of ethical problems that surface in the public square. But there's an even bigger question, and this is what we'll be talking about today. Can government actually be the instrument of justice, of good, of human flourishing? To start the discussion, we hear again from one of our own panelists, our co-host Chuck Colson.
Just before I left the White House, the president sent me on a mission to visit the Soviet Union. We were locked into a very, very difficult situation with the Soviets. The president had been there in 1972 in the spring, had set up a strategic arms agreement and a grain deal. That was the deal. We would send them grain and they would limit the development of nuclear weapons. So very, very important. But this had run a cropper in the Congress because the Congress was angry, members of Congress were angry that the Soviets were not letting out Jews who wanted to emigrate out of the Soviet Union. They were keeping them all in. And so there was an amendment to the bill in Congress that would have allowed us to start shipping grain to the Soviet Union to block that grain until they would release Soviet Jews. I went to Moscow right when this issue was boiling. Very few Americans had been there because we just opened up relationships. I ended up in the Kremlin one afternoon negotiating with Vasily Kuznetsov, who was the hardline Soviet negotiator. The question was, could I get Jews released so that the amendment in Congress wouldn't block the shipping of grain and therefore wouldn't block the arms agreement that Nixon had entered into, which was historic and extremely important to the national security. And we sat at one of those long tables with all the Americans on one side and all the Soviets on the other side. And went for about 2 hours. This guy was really tough, and he kept saying to me, pound the table, he'd say, Mr. Colson, you come here and you're trying to interfere with our domestic affairs. And I kept countering him. I kept saying, no, human rights aren't domestic affairs. You don't give human rights to people in the government, and you can't take them away. Human rights are God-given. I remember quoting the language of the Declaration of Independence, and I'm reading this to him, and he's getting angry and angrier and angrier. And I learned ahead of time that what you do with them is just keep pressing and don't show any sign of weakness. And so I just kept getting tougher and tougher. I said, we're not interfering in your domestic affairs. We're talking about human rights. And after about 2 hours, you could see everybody was getting tense, and he was beginning to weaken. I saw a sign of it, and all of a sudden he hit the table. He said, okay, Mr. Colson, you can tell your president we'll do our part. And as a result of that, within days thereafter, they released 35,000 Soviet Jews. But what I learned out of that was that the unique contribution that America makes to the world, and it is unique, is to promote the idea that people are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. This is the fundamental ethic on which the Western civilization was built.
So there you have an example of where government can and was an instrument of good. Even a self-confessed rascal like Chuck Colson can promote the common welfare. So let's talk about this basic argument that he made to the Soviet officials, and let's hear thoughts on justice. How would you define it? What is the government's proper role?
Robert George responds.
Well, in the clip that we saw, Chuck Colson laid it out there pretty clearly by quoting our founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it goes on to say that it's fundamentally for the protection of these rights that governments are instituted among men.
And his job is to preserve order, to do justice, and to promote human flourishing. That's what government does. In the biblical understanding, that's what it does, and that's what it's done in the Western model.
Michael Miller joins in.
But we also need to restrain government. And I think Madison said it best, and I won't have a perfect quote here, but he said the first task of government is to kind of create order and secure rights and liberty, and then the second task is to restrain the governors. And so this is where you need government, but you need a limited government. And the root of this, of course, is what Christians understand as the doctrine of original sin. You have to limit power because of its tendency to corrupt.
Professor Sunshine?
One thing that I think is particularly important in current political discussions is to highlight the fact that rights don't come from government, that rights that are inalienable rights are endowed by our Creator. It's something that's inherent to what it means to be human. And government exists to protect those rights, but it doesn't grant those rights. It recognizes them.
So what is the idea of distributive justice? What does that mean?
Scott Ray responds.
It's justice in the distribution of the benefits and burdens of society. And it's a complicated theory, the theory of distributive justice, and a controversial one. Sometimes we talk about a social safety net. And why do we talk about a social safety net? Because we recognize that sometimes justice requires us to meet needs and even to use the mechanisms of government, the mechanisms of political power to meet needs. That doesn't mean that's the only way or that it's usually the best way. Private charitable enterprises are probably more important and ordinarily the best way. But we shouldn't rule out the possibility that government needs to come in to meet needs. Now that raises the question, government at what level? I mean, perhaps we don't want the central government as involved in the distribution of benefits and burdens as it is in our own society. Perhaps lower levels of government under the principle of what's called subsidiarity should be playing a bigger role. But that's essentially what distributive justice questions are about, Brit.
Michael Miller responds.
If we agree then that we ought to try to achieve some distributive justice, the question becomes then how best to effect that and what is the most effective?
And one way to understand subsidiarity simply is either decentralization or localism. That is, those local groups handle it so that the government doesn't crowd out private charity. And that's what I think a way to understand subsidiarity is thinking of it as localism.
If the family can do it, then let's leave government out of it. If private associations that assist the family, churches, civic associations, Boy Scouts and so forth, can do it without governmental involvement, it's better to do it that way. It'll be more effective and more protective of freedom and create less risks of tyranny. The defense of the nation, that cannot be done by the city of Cleveland. That's got to be done by the government of the United States. Certainly can't be done by private associations. So there's a classic case of where you need central power. But central power, like all power, has to be checked. It has to be limited. That's the Madisonian genius.
But there's a second side of justice that has to be talked about, and that's retributive justice. Justice is defined by the Greeks as giving everyone his due. When I checked into prison, there was a GS7 caseworker who was checking me in, former special counsel of the President of the United States. He didn't seem intimidated. He said to me, "You know why you're here, Mr. Colson?" I said, "I think I do." He said, "You're here to be punished." And that's exactly right. That's what punishment is, a response to be sure that the victim is remedied and the scales of justice are balanced.
Where else can we look for examples of, government effectively applying a moral standard?
And notice that we are willing to criticize our government. Americans are willing to criticize our government even when they are engaged in actions that protect us against aggressors, when they use force that's not morally justified. We do hold our governments to moral standards.
The British clergy denounced their own government when they did carpet bombing. The RAF did carpet bombing of Dresden. Right, exactly.
This, I think, reflects the deep underlying reality, especially in the influence of Judeo-Christianity, that government must be under the moral law. And law, how people say, well, you can't legislate morality. Well, of course, that's what law is. It's the legislation of morality, right? And it's rooted in a moral order. And if the government violates those rights, then it's wrong, right? And it should be changed. And how you change it, of course, is a very complex thing.
And of course, in our own history, we had the example of the Civil War, which was fought for the purpose of entering what was ultimately believed and has now come to be universally accepted as a great moral wrong, indeed the original sin of American life. And we can certainly trace the emergence of that idea, that this idea of slavery was wrong, to moral thinking.
One of the reasons why we're concerned with protecting human rights, one of the reasons why we have just war doctrine, that there are times when it is appropriate to fight, but if we fight, we have to fight in an appropriate way, is a notion that government also has a role in promoting virtue among the citizens. It's not just a matter of government stepping back and providing an environment for people to do whatever they want to do. The government, as understood by the founders, had a role in actively promoting virtue among the citizenry.
It reminds me of another Martin Luther King quote. He said that government should not legislate morality, but they could regulate behavior.
Yes, King, David, that reminds me of King's statement that the law can't make people love me if they hate me because of my race. They can't make people love me, but law can stop them from killing me.
Exactly, regulate behavior.
So let's examine that and the thinking of a particular man. David?
There's a figure named Dietrich Bonhoeffer who has and will inspire generations just like Martin Luther King Jr. has in this country. He left the German world and challenged the church as it was co-opted by the Nazis. He began an underground seminary movement to challenge the Nazi domain, who had overtaken the church and was preaching Hitler as Lord and not just God or Christ as Lord. He was arrested, imprisoned in Tegel prison, tortured, interrogated for a couple years, wrote one of his greatest works that we know today, Ethics, which has been compiled later in bits and manuscripts that were smuggled out of prison. Ultimately, he gave his life, was executed, hung in Flossenburg prison camp 11 days before the Allied forces, American forces, liberated that camp.
What happened, in his view and in the view of this panel, to cause the utter collapse of ethics in that country where he lived? What happened?
Well, Britt, we have it in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's own words. Here's what he said. The great masquerade of evil has played havoc with all of our ethical concepts. For evil to appear disguised as light, charity, historical necessity, or social justice is quite bewildering to anyone brought up on our traditional ethical concepts. He's here talking about the Judeo-Christian ethic. He goes on. What lies behind the collapse of ethics is the death of civil courage, courage in the public square. Unless we have the courage to fight for a revival of wholesome reserve between man and man, we shall perish in an anarchy of human values. One may ask whether there have ever been in human history people with so little ground under their feet. And then he goes on to talk, Britt, about the collapse of conscience, people giving up the idea of conscience. The idea of conscience is what Newman called a stern monitor, imposing on us duty, our recognition of duty to do what's right, even in the face of powerful temptations and incentives to do what's wrong.
And he poses a powerful question at the beginning of his book, Ethics. He said, ethics is not asking the question, how can I be good? He thinks that's the wrong question. He said, how do I discern the will of God? And that's what I ought to do. In fact, he has no time for people in general, Christians in particular, who sit on the sidelines and keep clean hands. One of the places he writes, better to engage in trying to defeat evil and risk getting your hands dirty and later fall on your knees for the grace and mercy of God than to sit on the sidelines and be proud of how clean your hands are.
Stepping back from Bonhoeffer a moment, I think it's important also to realize that Germany was one of the great industrial powers. They had probably the most highly educated populace in the world, and they still voted Hitler into power.
This is the culture that produced Beethoven, Bach, Goethe, so many great poets. It's a lesson to us that we can easily fall into grave evil, and to some extent, of course, already have.
And you see, too, I think if you look in Germany, and Weimar Republic, and the rise of the German National Socialists, you see an increasing relativism, acceptance of eugenics, acceptance of values are just whatever that you make them to be, will to power. And so evil doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. I mean, obviously, the German National Socialists didn't get 70% of the vote when Hitler was elected into power. But nevertheless, that they could even possibly be accepted at all, I think, shows the danger of when you have bad ideas ruling your society.
And it began with the abandonment of the sanctity of life ethic. And not the killing of Jews or gypsies or others, that eventually came. It began with the killing of handicapped people. People who were considered inferior because they weren't of the physical or mental powers of other people. That's how it began.
When they abandoned...
And that, of course, was rooted in an idea.
An idea,
very
the
bad
idea of
idea.
eugenics.
Right.
When the handicapped became conceived as useless eaters, that's what the Nazis called them, useless. And remember, picking up this idea from sophisticated, progressive people. They didn't invent it.
And once you cross that line and abandon that ethic, then the evil becomes systemic. So systemic that the best doctors in the world in Germany were performing horrendous experiments on human beings.
And so ideas and actions do kind of desensitize us to evil. And I think one of the things we need to do is resensitize ourselves to evil and resensitize ourselves to good.
We forget, because we have short memories, that it was less than 2 centuries ago that slavery was the law of the land in Britain. It took a man, a politician, who felt deeply convicted that this was unjust, and he risked his whole political career. His name was William Wilberforce, and maybe you've seen the scenes from Amazing Grace where he rolls his petition out in the floor of the Parliament. A 20-year fight, but before he died in 1833, slavery was abolished in the British Empire.
We have taken a petition calling for the abolition of the slave trade to all the great cities of this country. It has been signed by over 390,000 people. However, this petition is not yet complete. There is one more person who wishes to add his name.
Do something.
Mr. Speaker, I humbly request a suspension while we take time to examine the signatures on this document.
There is something very provoking in the dry, calm way my honourable friend seeks delay.
Mr. Speaker, will he not give way?
Is the desolation of Africa suspended?
Please, gentlemen.
Is the work of death suspended?
You bring petitions into the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, we cannot
As if this
insult
country
forebearers of
should
heaven
be
with more
ruled by
delay.
the rule of the mob rather than its natural rulers.
Order!
The rule of paper reeks of rebellion.
No matter how loud you shout, you will not drown out the voice of the people.
What you see there is a nation struggling to do the right thing, to emerge as a more developed and a more just society. So let's examine that. Professor George.
I was thinking as we were watching the clip of Amazing Grace of that petition that Wilberforce rolled out. It made me think of a project that Mr. Colson and I are involved in right now called the Manhattan Declaration. Which has been signed by hundreds of thousands of people, declaring their fidelity to the foundational principles of civil society and of justice and the common good. The principle of the sanctity of human life, the dignity of marriage and the family, and the rights of conscience and religious liberty. I think that people who are watching these lessons should read the Manhattan Declaration with its pledge that while we will ungrudgingly render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, we will never render unto Caesar what is God's. And if you agree, sign on. Become one of those hundreds of thousands. Let's make it millions.
Before all the students rush out of the room to do that, let's bring some of them into this discussion.
They've done it already on their iPhones.
Go ahead, question.
Hi, my name is Matthew Sandifer. Thank you for this great discussion. I think we've seen in these
in these sessions that the government can sometimes have a very direct involvement in society in bringing about social change. For example, segregation. I think right now with abortion, many of us find ourselves in that same position where we see what the government's doing, we don't agree with it. How do we then act upon that?
We can exercise our freedom of speech. We can support candidates. We can stuff envelopes. We can make phone calls. We can encourage people who will stand up for what's right. We'll stand up for what's right ourselves. We can listen to counter-arguments knowing that perhaps we're wrong. We're fallible. Maybe we're mistaken. We can engage our fellow citizens in argument and counter-argument to try to get to the truth of these matters and to persuade people to change unjust laws.
You have to realize that politics is downstream from culture. Nothing happens in the political world that has any lasting effect unless it starts in the culture. So the answer is, if you want political change, you have to work on the grassroots level. It may not look like it's going to produce the results you want by just talking to your neighbors, because, I mean, what effect are they going to have on the Supreme Court? But over time, and that's the key, over time, you have to be patient. Building a grassroots support for social change is the only way it lasts. It cannot be done top down.
Yeah, picking up on that, I'm guessing you're 21 or 22 years old? Be patient. Don't become cynical. Wilberforce started that at your age, and when it finally passed, he was, in his 50s. These are long haul things. What Martin Luther King did, he didn't just do during his life. That started with Rosa Parks in a way even before that at the turn of the century. When you find your passion, your issue that you're fired up for, go for it. But understand it's not, we live in the instant response time, on-demand era. Changing social issues are lifetime issues, so hang in there with it and don't be put off by the setbacks.
Michael.
We have to remember, and I think this goes partially to your question, that there's no perfect governmental system because governments are run by fallen human beings. And we have to avoid utopian tendencies. We have to avoid comparing the good and the possible with some unattainable kind of kingdom of heaven on earth. And we have to avoid utopianism because every time utopianism is tried, it leads to enslavement, death, and destruction. But we can make a change, and as Professor Miller said, we have to have complete hope that through the power of God, we can continue to improve things and not give up.
Another question? One more.
My name is Joseph Clare. Thank you all, panelists, for this intriguing discussion. There's this question burning as to how we put together these two appeals to the absolute moral truths and then our human inadequacy and fallibility. And the question becomes, who has the authority, given that we may never appropriate the full absolutes, and then how much latitude or relativity is there when we look at other cultures around the world or other cultures in history?
Our founders, men like Washington and Adams and Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson, bequeathed to us a wonderful system. A system of republican government, as they called it. It's a system that encourages deliberation and thinking and argument and persuasion before we vote. As Churchill rightly said, it might be the worst system, democracy, but if it's the worst system, it's the worst system except for all the others. So it's what we have, and it gives us this gift, the ability when we see a wrong to go to our fellow citizens and argue with them, remonstrate with them. Our freedom of speech is protected, and we've got to protect it because it's such an important instrument of justice.
The argument that is most often raised against the idea of absolute morality is in fact the argument from cultural relativism, whether you view it historically or contemporaneously. Different cultures do have different standards. And our argument has been that there are some foundational issues that are accessible to reason that everybody knows, that there is, as was said, a moral law that's written in the heart. So how do we reconcile the fact that there is a diversity of opinion on right and wrong with the idea that there is an absolute right and wrong that's knowable? The first point here, I think, is that although there is a great deal of cultural diversity, the extent of that cultural diversity can be exaggerated. I use the example of the Golden Rule. Golden Rule exists across the board in pretty much every major religious tradition. The point is, everybody recognizes that however you define your neighbor, which may vary, there are certain responsibilities you have toward your neighbor. This is a point C.S. Lewis makes. The general rules across the board in societies are much closer than people give them credit for. It's just the specific applications that's going to vary.
I think what your question presupposes is that all of us can seek absolute truth and absolute standards, but we should do so without thinking that we're absolutely right. We should do it with a good bit of humility, because we're fallible and we're learning, and the more we study and the more we learn, the wiser we become. That's the process of life.
And one other thing quickly is that, in one sense, we're never going to come to the fullness of truth. I mean, this is why, as St. Paul says, we see dimly. Plato, he said, man is not the measure of all things. God is the measure of all things. And I think from a Christian understanding, we recognize that we're limited, but that we can find truth ultimately in God.
So this has been an incredibly stimulating discussion. The current breakdown in our society, the economic crisis caused by moral factors, failures at government, failures at Wall Street, failures with the lending institutions, failures with the public, which lost sight of the Christian work ethic that was our great inheritance in this country. But then we said we can know moral law. It is knowable. And then we said we can train the conscience, train the intellect, the sentiments, in such a way that the will can be transformed so that we can live good lives. We took these ethical concepts and we measured them against questions of life and death, which are before us at this moment. We then took it and applied it in the workplace, which is vital to understand that it isn't just obsessive self-desire and fulfillment, but it's doing something of importance in the community. And today we've come to what I think will be a startling revelation for people watching this, and that is that good ethics can make a difference in public affairs in terms of how we live as a society and in international relations. I just want to leave you with one closing thought. I believe at the root of what it is that makes us good and just and decent is a recognition that we owe a debt to those who have gone before us. For me, one of the most moving scenes I've ever seen, and Spielberg is a cinematic genius, he knew exactly what he was doing when he filmed Saving Private Ryan, the story of a soldier who was lost but then found, and of Captain Miller, his commanding officer, who took a bullet and saved his life, and is slumped against a tank and dying. And he looks over at Ryan, the young 21-year-old whose life he just saved, and he said, "Earn it, with his dying gasps. The scene immediately moves to the graveyard. Private Ryan, now 70, has come back to visit, goes for the grave marker, kneels, finds Captain Miller's grave marker, and says this: "Every day I've thought of that conversation we had on the bridge. I've tried to live a life worthy of your sacrifice." And then he stands up and turns to his wife and says with the most pained and plaintive expression on his face, "Have I been a good man?" He turns to her and asks this question, the most probing question any of us can ask. And at some point in your life, you will ask it. And in that moment, you come to terms with really who you are, as Ryan did that at that grave marker.
Chuck, I would just urge the young people who are here and anyone who sees these films to take a moment every now and then to take the advice of some wise old Greek philosophers, and that is to live your life in anticipation of your death, to live with death at the horizon, because death will come for us all. Consider whether what you are doing now makes sense in view of your death. Will you be able to look back at the moment of death and say, yes, I lived a good and worthy life, a life worthy of those who sacrificed for me? Am I doing what's right? Am I doing what I could do for other people? those other people who, like me, are made in the image and likeness of God.
Shane Morris here again. I hope you enjoyed our special presentation of Chuck Colson's and Robert George's series, Doing the Right Thing. If you're interested in purchasing the Doing the Right Thing DVD series, please come to our online bookstore at breakpoint.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.